Hi, my name's Emily Magnuson, and for my final research project, I researched the history and present conditions of education in rural Alaska. The history of education in rural Alaska has been highly contentious, both socially and politically. There's been a history of cultural conflict between education standards and educators and expectations of rural communities. Politically, the state or territory juggled educational responsibility with the federal government for many years. Some of this juggling led to lack of school options in rural communities. For many years, there weren't high schools that students could attend in their home communities, and this forced students to either drop out of school or attend schools in community hubs, transportation hubs, urban areas, or boarding schools. Boarding schools had their own specific issues with certain histories of abuse and student problems. There's also undeniably been a history of cultural coercion in some communities with educational standards intentionally replacing Alaska Native cultural components. 23% of Alaskan students are Native. Of the Native student population, 60% attend schools in rural areas, often in their own home communities, and then 40% attend urban schools in Fairbanks, Anchorage, or Juneau. Now, education in Alaska is completely unique compared to the rest of the United States. It's a vast, wild landscape, with many rural communities with very small populations completely off the road system. It's uncomparable to any other part of the US. A big part of this research project for me was looking into the history of education in Alaska, which I had very little knowledge about. So when Alaska was purchased from Russia, it became a territory. While it was a territory, in 1884 was the first time that federal education standards and rules were created. One of the leading acts among this was the Organic Act. It specifically laid out who was responsible for education in Alaska, and specifically that the government was responsible for the education of children of all races. It pointed out the Bureau of Education and the Bureau of Indian Affairs as the two cabinets within the Department of Interior to be responsible for educating Alaska's children. And these two departments were involved all the way through the late 80s. In the early 1900s, there were a huge influx of non-native children in Alaska schools. Around this time, gold was discovered in many places throughout Alaska, and families were moving from the lower 48 to Alaska to pursue mining opportunities. The territory didn't have a way to fix this, so the federal government granted the territory power to create schools through taxation. However, for this to work, um, communities had to be big enough to have a tax base. So rural villages didn't have enough people with a cash income to tax to create schools. So to fix this problem in 1905, the Nelson Act laid out um, steps for schools to be created outside of these taxable communities. In 1928, the Merriam Report was released to the U.S. Congress. It was an assessment of educational standards in indigenous populations throughout the lower 48 and Alaska. It was the beginning of major shifts in Alaska Native education as a response to outlining some educational failures. So, following this, as a direct result of it, in 1934, the Johnson O'Malley Act was created by Congress. It gave the Department of the Interior's secretary the power to create contracts directly with the territory of Alaska, specifically to fix educational problems. The biggest result of this was the transfer of school from Department of Interior agencies to the territorial government. So now, at this point, a dual educational system began between the territorial government and the federal government. Alaska became a state in 1959, so this uh, dual educational system is now operating between the federal government and the state government. They were operating separately, with some communities having educational gaps not being filled by either government. In 1972, the Indian Education Act was created by Congress to try and fill in these holes between state and federal education programs. Um, Programs were mostly state-run by the 80s, with only 10 Bureau of Indian Affairs schools left. Starting in 1975, the current school districts that are still in place today were created. They were called Regional Education Attendance Areas. There's 22 districts. They're each run by a school board governing body. One thing that factored into this decision was a lawsuit already going on before 1975, but was settled in 1976. It was a class action lawsuit against the state of Alaska alleging racial discrimination in education. So there were many communities that did not have high schools, which forced students to go to other communities to continue their education. Since rural communities were predominantly Alaska Native, the lawsuit alleged the state was discriminating against Alaska Natives. So this meant that more high schools were created throughout the state. Basically, by the early 1980s, there were no more federal-run schools, and the state was responsible for most education. So in present day, where do kids go to school in rural Alaska? There's three main modes. The first is village schools, so children attending a school in their birth community. They're often small, with very few students, and because of this, they're multi-grade schools, kindergarten through 12th grade. There's a small number of teachers. Often one of those teachers, or at least a teacher's aide, is an Alaska Native themselves. These school curriculums may also include Alaska Native language lessons. The next mode is regional center schools. So these would be in transportation hubs, larger communities such as Bethel, Barrow, Sitka, or Kotzebue. These communities are often on the road system or the ferry system, or have an airport with more air traffic. The curriculums at these schools are more varied, kind of an overlap between what may be taught at village schools and urban schools. Urban schools are the third option for Alaska Native students. Some leave their villages and communities and attend school in Anchorage, Fairbanks, or Juneau. Approximately 30% of Alaska Native students do this. For such students, there are federal funds that kind of are tailored to Alaska Native programs within state-funded schools. So in the past, there have been some major failures and conflicts for education in rural Alaska, one of which is pretty serious colonial-style cultural eradication through school. This was described by Jester as the remake of the Alaska Native according to the image of dominant society. So kind of using education as a tool to remove or distance students from their own culture and kind of remake them into more mainstream American culture. Another issue is that teaching styles have not always been suitable, and educational standards have also not been suitable for rural education. There have been some pretty fundamental differences in even just day-to-day communication style between non-native and non-native teachers and native students. There may also be differences in scheduling expectations or homework expectations. Teachers may want to start at a specific time, but students and their families expect it to be more a little more flexible, or just basic differences. Rural education curriculums have often excluded traditional knowledge and language, which has been a problem for Alaska Native communities to not have their culture included in part of students' education. And then also, undeniably, there's been a history of racism and discrimination on the part of teachers and educators against the differences between themselves and Alaska Native students. There have been some major successes, particularly in recent times. There's been a trend back towards including Alaska Native culture and language in school curriculums. A big part of this has been the increased number of teachers, Alaska Native teachers, in the state of Alaska. So more students are attending college elsewhere and then returning to their communities to become teachers where they grew up. Uh, Reports have shown that when the teacher and group of students come from the same cultural background, educational outcomes, and even just basic day-to-day classroom participation are much better. Right now, only 6% of teachers in Alaska are Alaska Native, but as I said before, most rural schools have at least one Alaska Native teacher, aide, or administrator. One last major concern with education in rural Alaska is the issue of language preservation. So the majority of Alaska Native language speakers are over the age of 50, which means those who know the languages are aging rapidly. Alaska Native communities are extremely concerned about this issue. However, many see required school as an obstacle to children learning Alaska Native languages. So there's several reasons for this. They see school as a time-consuming thing where, children may have less opportunities to interact with elders and learn language because they're in school instead of, pursuing subsistence activities or spending time with their families. In general, standard Alaska education curriculums don't include Alaska Native languages, and there are so many languages that each school may not be addressing all the languages specific to those regions if they do include a Native language component at all. One other concern Alaska Natives have shown is that creating these educational standards mandated by the state socially undermines the value of traditional knowledge, that it kind of invalidates traditional knowledge by saying, these are the things you are expected to learn in school, and that, those things don't include traditional knowledge. So through this research project, I was thinking about, and reading, people's suggestions for future solutions in Alaska Native education. The first is flexibility in school scheduling, so a more flexible school school year dates somehow, that people have expressed concern with, children being required to be in school in August conflicts with fall time subsistence activities. Another issue is that these educational standards may not really describe what's going on in rural communities. A lot of standards aren't being met in villages, but there are kind of some greater issues going on, and it's uncertain if children are really not meeting their educational standards. Studies have shown that, as I said before, cultural connections between the teacher and students have really increased educational success. So hopefully in the future, the trend will continue with more Alaska Native adults returning to their communities to become educators. A last solution provided was kind of alternative educational opportunities. So maybe allowing students to receive some sort of credit or kind of like alternative activity options by going to culture camps that are already being put on by their villages, or other cultural activities where they could gain time interacting with elders and others in their communities.